Okay, so part two of module 11, the vilification of the Jews in the gospel literature as opposed to the vindication of Pilate. So, I did point out that, and I had pointed this out in the lecture as well, that as the gospel literature evolves from Mark through Matthew, Luke, and into John, it seems that the tendency to vilify the Jews and vindicate Pilate sort of increases. And I pointed out the passage in Matthew, I believe it's Matthew 27, I don't remember the exact verse, you can find it, where the trial in front of Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate, washes his hands of the matter, he says, and this is all unique to Matthew, by the way, washes his hands, says, I see nothing wrong with this man, and the high priest or one of the officials says, crucify him, his blood be upon us and our descendants forever. Very, very condemning expression that you don't find in Mark. Or the whole scene of Pilate washing his hands. And then in the Gospel of Luke, which is, probably right around maybe written a little bit after the Gospel of Matthew, we see Pilate, for instance, sending, and this is unique to Luke, right, sending Jesus to Herod. Now, this is not the Herod of the Nativity story. This is, I forget offhand, if it's the sons or grandsons of Herod after Herod died. I believe it was his grandsons. His kingdom was distributed among these four descendants. And a fellow named Herod Antipas was given authority over Galilee. And so Pilate says, well, Jesus is a Galilean, let's send him to the authority in Galilee, to Herod Antipas. And this is unique to Luke, another attempt by Pilate to vindicate or to, not crucify Jesus, to acquit him, is the word. Another attempt to acquit him, sent him to Herod Antipas. And then he comes back and Herod Antipas says, I find nothing wrong with him. And then Pilate goes again 2 or 3 more times back to the people and says, I find nothing wrong with him. And the whole mob, the whole crowd is shouting, crucify him, crucify him. So, the question is why is this happening? Why is this being portrayed this way? And I pointed out to students that, most of the gospel material emerges from the period of time after the Jewish rebellion against the Romans, 66 to 70 CE. The Gospel of Mark is usually considered to have been written during that time, during the rebellion, but the other three Gospels are written after the rebellion. And there's by the time that rebellion ends, the various sects of Jews that existed before the rebellion, we hear from Josephus that there were 4 different groups of Jews: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, who were probably the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Zealots, the people who carried out the rebellion. There were these 4 groups, according to Josephus. After the rebellion, there were probably 2 groups of Jews. And this may sound ironic, but I think it's true. There were 2 groups of Jews and Christians. And these 2 groups were sort of in competition, vying for legitimacy within the Roman Empire. The Jews, while, the Romans didn't particularly love them, after all, they did rebel, and it was a very difficult rebellion to put down. Emperor Titus built a huge arch just up the road from the Colosseum, the so-called Arch of Titus, that shows the spoils from the temple in Jerusalem being taken back to Rome. It was a big deal, that rebellion. It took a long time to put it down. They didn't love the Jews. The Jews also had these weird customs, mutilating male penises, and they were, lazy. They wanted a day off of work once a week. So, they were kind of weird, a little rebellious, but the Romans had sort of gotten used to them. They had been around for a long time. They kept to themselves. They didn't bother anybody. And so they were more or less accepted. They had a certain legitimacy within the empire. And then along comes Christians, and now the Christians aren't keeping to themselves. They're converting people. They're converting people to this religion, which at first, just seems to the Romans as some other, strange religion coming out of Judea. But now, their family members are converting to this religion. The members of the military are converting to this religion. They're refusing to participate in the civic religion of the Romans. And this is a much greater threat to Rome when Romans are now taking up this new religion in large numbers. So Christians were much more of a threat. So the early Christian community, in trying to gain legitimacy within the Roman Empire, is claiming, hey, look, we're Jews, all right? We're the real Jews. We are the successors to these Jews. And besides, the notion that you would try to gain legitimacy within the Roman Empire with a story that says that the Roman procurator killed your leader, your god, would not go over very well. So, for lack of a better word, there's a certain PR function here. I don't mean to be crass, but I think that's true. Just a certain PR, an attempt by the early church to show the Jews in a bad light and to vindicate the Roman procurator at the same time that the early Christians, are trying to gain legitimacy within the Roman Empire. Then we talked about Gina had written an entry, and I think on her discussion board as well, about the role of Torah in the writings of Paul. So, I asked the question, so what is Torah for Paul? And I pointed out the passage in chapter 5 of Paul's letter to the Romans, where Paul basically says that, where there is no law, sin exists before the law, and the law, I think in this case, is Torah. Sin exists before the law, but where there is no law, where there is no Torah, sin is not counted. You're not accountable for sin if there is no law. So he then goes on to say that the law came in to increase the trespass. In other words, you can't keep all of these laws. So you're going to violate these laws. That's sin. That's now accountable to you as sin. So the law comes in to increase the trespass so that God's grace could be demonstrated. That is, so that God could offer this free gift of the incarnation of Christ and the salvific sacrifice of Christ as a free gift to people who, in effect, don't deserve it because, they're sinners. And Torah is brought in to increase sin, to increase the trespass. At least that's what Paul says in chapter 5. And of course, I point out that, it's hard to interpret Paul. We're listening to, in any given letter, we're listening to one segment of one side of a telephone conversation. Paul probably visited his congregations, had visits from his congregations, maybe wrote numerous letters to his congregations. So we're getting one little snippet, and at the same time, we're getting one side of that snippet. So it's hard to say. Gina mentioned that she thought maybe Paul was being sarcastic, that there is a sense from the article that she read in the Encyclopedia Judaica that, there's a certain holiness. The Torah tells you how to behave in order to be holy, a holy people. I pointed out that I think it's in chapter 8 of Romans, Paul says something to the effect of, because people would question, now, if there's no law, does that mean we can do whatever we want? And Paul says, no, of course not, because you have died to sin, you have died with Christ, you have died to sin, you have died to the flesh, and you have been sort of resurrected with Christ in the Spirit. You are spiritual beings, and so you just would naturally not, do things that would be against God's way, because you're now spiritual beings. And I pointed out that there's a passage in the book of the prophet Jeremiah where Jeremiah talks about a new covenant, and that it would not be, it would be a covenant that would be written on people's hearts. In other words, people would just naturally follow God's Torah, follow God's way. And I think Gina and I then agreed that we could both go along with that very well, that notion of just naturally understanding what it is that God wants and how we live godly, holy lives. So I think that's pretty much what we covered in a nutshell. And again, I truly apologize for the really stupid error of just not pressing that record button. But I think I've captured much of what we discussed in that plenary session. I would point out, please pay attention to the rubrics for the review paper. I do want, your personal insights, your critical thinking. How do you look at these issues? How can these issues be looked at in different ways? But again, you have to show me that, you have to demonstrate to me that you have grappled with, come to an understanding of the course material. And the rubrics for the discussion board and the rubrics for the review paper are pretty much the same. The one difference, quite frankly, is that one of the rubrics for the review paper is that I'm looking for good writing, all right, clarity, good grammar usage, good progression of ideas. This is a second draft. This is a real essay. It's not a discussion board response. So I expect you to take some care in terms of your writing skills. And finally, while you have gotten comments from your peers, please don't forget that I also make comments to your review journal entries, and we'll be looking to see how you followed up on those. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, you know where I am, you know how to reach me, and please feel free to do so. Good luck and take care. Bye.